We're back with the Dr. Joe Show with Patrick Troy-Brandt, a veteran of our United States military. And we're talking about his transition into theater from that career.
Yeah, we were talking about some of the parallels when we were off air. So I'm wondering whether you could just extrapolate on that a bit between theater and the service.
Sure. Well, and I think you had, sort of brought it up as kind of contrasting the two, like how does a soldier's mind go from that environment into an actor's mind? And yeah, I was kind of saying that I think that there's a perception of what makes the ideal soldier's brain or soldier's mind versus what actually does. And maybe some people think that an ideal soldier is one that just follows orders strictly by the book and doesn't question them and never thinks outside of that parameter. But really, what an ideal soldier can do is know the mission, but improvise, in order to get what the idea of the mission is when things start to go wrong. Because as anyone knows, it has been in any job anywhere, things always go wrong. Murphy's Law is not just a military thing. So in the same vein, that a soldier needs to be able to improvise, but still needs to have the main idea of the mission objective in mind. It's the same with the actor. You have an actor on stage that has memorized lines and has a beginning of the scene, middle, and an end of the scene. But what the real actor needs to be able to do is receive everything that's happening in that moment and everything that's truthful, that have been different than the night before or the rehearsal, and so an actor's ability to improv while still getting to the end of the scene, it quite directly parallels what the modern soldier is asked to do. Not the soldier 100 years ago who needed to just take a piece of land and hold it, or die trying.
So what is that evolution from that soldier that you just described to the modern soldier? How do you understand that happening?
Well, I understand it from a very amateur anecdotal, I guess, perspective, I would say. But so I was a paratrooper, right? And one of the big hallmarks of an airborne unit is the ability to operate when you're all scattered, 6 ways to Sunday all over a drop zone. So what started in the paratroopers was the dissemination of information down to the lowest ranking guy. And this was in World War II, right? So in World War II, typically, you had your lowly privates and they didn't know anything about the operation. The sergeant knew what was going on. The officers knew. But if they were taken out, then these privates didn't really know what to do. So paratroopers started teaching everyone down. Everyone was on the same page. Everyone knew what the big picture was and what the small picture was. So if you had 3 or 4 little privates that they were the only ones on the drop zone that linked up in the middle of the night, they still knew what to do and still knew how to carry on the mission. So my understanding is that type of mentality slowly grew and grew and grew. And, the war that I was faced with, I was much more of a cop, than a soldier. I was boots on the ground, in uniform, a representation of authority mixed among a civilian population, trying to decipher who were the good and the bad people.
I don't think this listening audience knows where you were deployed. So can we just talk about that?
I was deployed to Afghanistan for a year in 2005, 2006, and I did 2 years in Iraq non-consecutively. So I was in Afghanistan for a year, back home for a year, in Iraq for a year, back home for a year, in Iraq again for another year, and that's when I was discharged.
And so with that context, I think it adds to what you're saying. So you're in uniform
Right.
in a village or a town, and your job is to do what?
That's a great question. And it's, gosh, I mean, I think another big misconception is that people will lump Iraq and Afghanistan into the same conflict. And
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways, it just really, really wasn't. But what was similar is that as a United States soldier, you're sticking out there like a sore thumb, and there's no real element of surprise, you know, especially in Afghanistan, unless you're, going on helicopters in the middle of the night somewhere. They'll see the cloud of a truck coming from miles away and they know you're coming.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I thought about that a lot. We're like uniformed police officers, rolling up in a community that's unwelcoming for one reason or another, and just how, there were so many times when we had these key leader engagements, when we'd be sitting down in the huts and the compounds with the local leadership, and you know there's a certain, I don't want to say arrogance in a disrespectful way, but there was definitely that sort of air of, we were playing a psychological game with them, being the Americans. Like we were just, yeah, just tell us what you need for your village and we'll get it to you, and then you tell us where the bad guys are, right?
Hmm.
And
Right.
that would happen again and again, and the amount of times that we would just kind of take that information for face value because we didn't have any other choice, and you need to have results. So if they tell you that the bad guys are over, in this compound or that compound, you get what evidence you can, and but the time comes you kind of have to act on it. I hope that kind of makes sense. It's what I'm talking about, as opposed to a uniformed enemy, where there's, the Germans are on that side, we're over here, they're in gray uniforms, go get them,
Hmm.
yeah, it was a lot like, I'm reminded of actually a movie that I consider kind of underrated and a bit of a sleeper, The Siege, starring Denzel Washington, which is a fictitious account of Islamic extremist cell that takes over New York City, I believe, and kind of what happens. This was pre 9/11, so we were imagining what would happen if an extremist
Hmm.
cell were to take over New York, and the army is called in to deal with it in martial law. And I believe Bruce Willis's character as the general of the army says, "You just brought in a broadsword to do the work of a scalpel." Um,
Hmm.
and I think that says a lot of the underlying issues in Afghanistan and Iraq. Uh,
Hmm.
but yeah,
Mark, did you want to add something, or so you?
Well, I was wondering if sometimes they had given you bad information in order to get good things for their community. I thought maybe you were going there. Is that something that happened?
it absolutely, and and another, I think, important factor that maybe a lot of people who weren't there don't realize is that in Afghanistan, particularly, and Iraq, it's not just extremist, versus American soldier. There are criminal elements there. There are just people that are there to try and profiteer off of, by, playing the game. And so, you roll up into a village and you have a corrupt police chief, who to our American eyes, he's the police chief, right? He's the guy in charge. Like, he's the uniform we go and see. All the locals know that this police chief is corrupt. They see the Americans talking with him and meeting with him. So what does that look like to them? All of a sudden, we're working for him. So they stop trusting us automatically, because of that. And then we see their mistrust as being shady, right? And then we're like, well, why are you all of a sudden automatically wary of the Americans? Does that mean you have something to hide from us? So, it's just this he said, she said, convoluted thing that I, I think 9 times out of 10, it just started to spin out of control just in time for a new deployment cycle to happen, right? And for, these, because that's another thing that I've heard my brothers and sisters gripe over constantly, is that it was so impossible for us to have any common relationship with the people on the ground because we were deployed for a year at a time. And excuse me, had a lot of Taco Bell before I came here. But and then in a year we're out and total strangers come in. I mean, they're Americans, but they don't know these, I mean, every American is different, just like everyone else is different.
Well, what was, I mean, again, you might not be able to answer, but what was the thinking behind that? A year in, then a year back home?
I think that it was the powers that be in charge thinking we need to make this look good, and we need to make it look like we're not keeping our soldiers away from their families for years on end, etc. I mean, I just think that would be such a crazy concept to people who are not actually over there. But I think if you really were to talk to a lot of veterans like myself that had a lot of time, outside the wire, as we would call it, outside of the base, engaged in the locals, I think that a lot of people would say that we needed to have those relationships to really understand. To understand what these people were going through, for another thing, because this war, this conflict deserved that humanity, because it's not just uniformed enemy. We're police without knowing our community.
Yeah, it is always about relationships and about trust and value. And of course, that's also what we do here at the Dr. Joe Show. We talk a lot about trust and value, respect. And we also trust and value our sponsors because we have relationships with them, and I want to share them with you now, listeners. So Larry, let's take a commercial break. We'll be right back with the Dr. Joe Show.
Stretch the